I'm a 30-year-old guy living alone in a small one-bedroom apartment. My life was simple: work, gym, occasional nights out with friends. I didn't have any major responsibilities outside of paying my bills. That changed with one phone call. It was my mother. Her voice was tense, rushed. She asked me to take in my two nieces, 5 and 7 years old. My brother and his wife were going through something, she said, and the kids had nowhere else to go. I asked what was going on, but she dodged every question. It's complicated, she kept repeating. Just help out for now. It won't be long. I reminded her that I lived in a tiny apartment, that I wasn't prepared to take care of two young kids, but she brushed it off. Family takes care of family, she said. We raised you better than to turn your back on your own blood. Before I could process what was happening, she told me they were already on their way. 2 hours later, my parents showed up at my door. My dad barely met my eyes as he carried in two small backpacks and set them by the couch. My mother hugged the girls, whispered something to them, and then turned to leave. No real goodbyes, no explanations. When I asked where my brother was, my dad muttered, "Busy," before stepping out the door, and just like that, they were gone. The girls stood awkwardly in the middle of my apartment. They didn't have suitcases, just their backpacks. I opened one: pajamas, a toothbrush, nothing else. No extra clothes, no school supplies, no toys. The older one, Mia, looked at me and asked, "Are we staying forever?" Something about the way she said it sent a chill down my spine. I tried calling my brother, straight to voicemail. I texted, no response. I tried again, and that's when I realized I had been blocked. My sister-in-law, same thing. I called my mother, but she didn't pick up. My dad either. I sent messages, left voicemails. Nothing. I sat down on the couch, staring at the two kids who had just been dumped on me with no warning. They were watching me closely, waiting. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. After ordering pizza, I started setting up a place for them to sleep. My apartment was not meant for kids. I had one bedroom, one couch, and barely any space. I grabbed some blankets and set them up on the floor next to my bed. As I tucked them in, the younger one, Lily, asked, "Can I have my stuffed bunny?" I looked at their tiny backpacks. No stuffed bunny. I told her I'd get her one tomorrow, but she turned over and buried her face in the pillow. Mia, still wide awake, suddenly whispered, "Mom and Dad had a big fight." I asked her what she meant, but she shook her head. We weren't supposed to hear. I tried again, gentler this time. Did something happen? She hesitated, then turned away. I don't know. It was clear she was afraid to say more. Lying in bed that night, I kept staring at the ceiling, my phone still in my hand. No new messages. No callbacks. No explanations. I had been completely cut off. I wasn't just babysitting for a few days. I had been tricked into taking these kids, and I had no idea why. The next morning, I made a decision. I was going to find out the truth. Early the next morning, I drove straight to my parents' house. They were sitting in the kitchen when I walked in, both looking like they had been expecting me. I demanded answers. Why had my nieces been dumped on me with no warning? Where was my brother? Why had he blocked me? My mother sighed, acting as if I was being dramatic. "This is just what family does," she said. My father stayed quiet, staring at the table. I pushed harder. My mother finally admitted that my brother was in trouble but refused to say more. My father muttered something about a legal situation. When I asked what kind of legal situation, my mother waved a hand, brushing it off. "Nothing that concerns you," she said. I asked where my brother and his wife were. My mother's lips tightened. "We don't know." It was a lie. She and my father exchanged a quick glance. Small but enough to confirm my suspicions. They weren't just covering for him. They knew exactly where he was. I pulled out my phone and checked social media. My brother's account was gone, completely wiped. His wife's profile was the same. No posts, no photos, nothing, as if they had never existed. That was when my phone rang. It was a family friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in months. His voice was low, hesitant. "I don't know what's going on," he said, "but you need to get a lawyer." I left my parents' house without another word. Back at my apartment, I watched my nieces as they ate breakfast. Mia, the older one, was unusually quiet. I asked if she wanted to talk about anything. She shook her head. I decided to try their school. Maybe someone there could give me answers. I called and asked if my nieces had been withdrawn, if there was any information on record about their parents. The receptionist put me on hold. A few minutes later, someone else picked up and told me they couldn't share any details without parental consent. I asked if they had even been attending school before they were dropped off with me. Again, no answers. That night, as I tucked the girls into bed, Mia finally spoke. "Daddy said we might have to stay away for a long time." I sat frozen. "Did he say why?" She hesitated. "He said it's safer." I pressed her gently for more, but she only shrugged. "I don't know." I barely slept. Something was seriously wrong. I had two kids under my roof. Their parents had disappeared. My own parents were hiding something, and now I had someone telling me I needed a lawyer. The next morning, I went back to my parents' house. I wasn't leaving without real answers this time. My father was in the living room. When he saw me, he sighed, rubbing his face like he had been waiting for this moment. My brother was accused of a crime, a serious one. I demanded to know what kind of crime, but my father refused to say. He just kept repeating, "It's complicated." I asked if my brother was running from the law. My father didn't deny it. I stood there processing everything. I had been tricked into taking in his kids. I didn't have legal custody. If he was running from the law, that meant I was holding on to children who could be considered missing. I could be in serious trouble. I told my parents I needed the truth, everything, or I would go to the police. That got a reaction. My mother's face paled. My father stood up, shaking his head. "Don't do that," he said. I told them I was done playing games. Either they came clean or I was getting child services involved. My mother started panicking. She begged me to just keep quiet. My mother stood frozen, her face pale. My father rubbed his temples, avoiding my gaze. The silence stretched until my mother finally cracked. My brother was under federal investigation. The words came out in a rush. He had embezzled money from his company, hundreds of thousands of dollars. His wife was involved too. The authorities had been closing in, so they fled the state to avoid arrest. The girls had been left behind because taking them would have made them easier to track. I stared at them, barely processing what I was hearing. My parents had known everything. They had lied to me. They tricked me into taking the kids to keep them out of the system, to keep my brother's escape clean. My mother clutched my arm, begging me to understand. "The kids are innocent," she kept repeating. "They don't deserve to suffer because of their parents' mistakes." I pulled away. This was never about the kids. This was about my parents covering for their son, hiding the truth while expecting me to clean up the mess. I asked if the authorities had already come looking for my brother. My father hesitated before nodding. The FBI had been at their house 2 days before my nieces were dumped on me. I stood up and walked to the door. My parents followed, still pleading. "If you go to the police, they'll come after us too," my father admitted, his voice lower now. That was when I realized they weren't just hiding my brother. They were actively helping him evade the law. I turned back. He ruined his own life. I drove straight to a lawyer. I explained everything, how my nieces had been left with me, how my brother and his wife had fled, how my parents had hidden the truth. The lawyer's face was serious. "You're in a dangerous position," he said. "If law enforcement thinks you're knowingly hiding these children to help your brother, you could be charged." I asked what I needed to do. "First, you need to contact Child Protective Services immediately." I sat there gripping the edge of my chair. "If the authorities come to you first," he continued, "it won't look good. You need to be the one to report this." I thanked him and walked out of the office, dialing Child Protective Services before I even reached my car. An agent picked up. I explained the situation. The children had been abandoned with me. Their parents were fugitives. I had no legal custody, and I needed to protect myself. The agent listened carefully, then told me they would send a team to assess the situation. That night, my parents called me repeatedly. I ignored every call. When they started sending long, frantic messages, I blocked them. They had lied to me, manipulated me, and put me in legal danger. I was done. The next afternoon, Child Protective Services arrived. The girls were playing on the floor when the agents knocked. I opened the door, letting them in. They were professional but firm, asking detailed questions. They examined the girls, checked their living conditions, and took notes. Then they explained what would happen next. The children would be placed in temporary care, while the legal system sorted everything out. When the agents gently told the girls they would be leaving, Mia grabbed my arm. "I don't want to go." Lily burst into tears. I knelt down, trying to explain, but what could I even say? That their parents had abandoned them, that their grandparents had lied, that I was forced to make this decision because the people who should have protected them had failed. The agents led them out the door, their small hands clutching their backpacks. I watched from the doorway as they were driven away. My phone buzzed one last time, an unknown number. I ignored it. My family had made their choice. Now I had made mine. The knock on my door came early the next morning. I opened it to find my parents standing outside, looking worse than I had ever seen them. My mother's face was blotchy, eyes red from crying. My father's expression was tense, jaw set like he was barely holding himself together. They pushed past me into the apartment before I could say anything. They were furious. My mother was in tears, shaking as she accused me of destroying the family. My father demanded that I fix this. "There has to be something you can do," he insisted, his voice shaking between anger and desperation. My mother sobbed, pleading, "You don't understand what this will do to the family." But I saw the truth in their eyes. They weren't asking me to fix things for the kids. They were asking me to cover for their lies. My mother clutched at my arm, sobbing that my nieces would suffer because of me. I stood there letting them vent, until they ran out of words. Then I simply told them no. My father's face darkened. His voice dropped, a quiet, dangerous tone. "You don't understand what you've done." I reminded them that they were the ones who lied. They were the ones who put me in this situation. I had done the only thing I could to protect myself and the kids. They weren't interested in hearing it. My mother was still crying as they walked out. My father turned back once. "You'll regret this," he muttered before slamming the door behind them. I called my lawyer immediately. He reassured me I had done the right thing and told me to start documenting everything. Any further contact with my parents needed to be written down, record it if possible. He also warned me to prepare for backlash. Days passed. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I kept expecting to hear the little footsteps of my nieces running down the hall, but there was nothing. I reminded myself over and over that this was for their safety. Then, after weeks of silence, my phone rang, a blocked number. I let it go to voicemail. Moments later, another call from an unknown number. I hesitated before picking up. My brother's voice came through the line. I had to use a burner phone. "You really made a mess of things," he said coldly. His voice was low, controlled, but there was an edge of anger beneath it. He wanted to know what I had done. I didn't answer. He demanded to know why I had overreacted and dragged the authorities into a misunderstanding. I told him to turn himself in. He laughed, cold, bitter. He started ranting about how I had always been the self-righteous one, how I had stabbed my own family in the back. He accused me of siding with the people who were trying to destroy him. He told me I had ruined everything. Then he hung up. I contacted my lawyer again. He had already been digging into my brother's case, and now he had more information. My brother wasn't just in trouble, he was in deep. The fraud case wasn't some small mistake. He and his wife had stolen from multiple companies, moved money through fake accounts, and were now wanted in several states. I confronted my parents again, hoping, maybe foolishly, that this new information would make them see reason. Instead, they doubled down. My mother insisted it was all exaggerated. My father muttered about how the system was rigged. They refused to believe anything that didn't fit the story they wanted to tell themselves. A few days later, a letter arrived in my mailbox, a cease and desist order from a lawyer. The letter accused me of spreading false accusations about my brother. It warned me to stop or face legal consequences. I forwarded it to my lawyer, who barely glanced at it before telling me to ignore it. "This is desperation," he said. "They know the truth is coming out." Then came the public records. Through legal filings, I discovered that my brother had already been indicted. The authorities had been building a case for months before he ran. They had evidence, witnesses, bank records. It was only a matter of time before they caught up to him. When I tried to tell my parents, they refused to hear it. Instead, they gave me an ultimatum. "Fix this," they said, "or we will cut you off." I laughed. Actually laughed. I told them there was nothing to fix. That was the last time we spoke. A few days later, my lawyer called me with news. A formal arrest warrant had been issued for my brother. The authorities were actively searching for him. Then late one night, my phone rang again. This time, it wasn't my brother. It was a federal agent. They wanted to know if I had any information about my brother's whereabouts. I told them the truth. I had no idea where he was. But I knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. A family friend reached out with news. My brother and his wife had fled the state. They weren't just avoiding arrest anymore. They were officially fugitives. The authorities were actively searching for them, and according to the friend, it was only a matter of time before they slipped up. Shortly after, the federal agents contacted me again. This time, they were much more direct. If I assisted my brother in any way, knowingly or unknowingly, I could be charged. They warned me that even indirect help, like passing along messages through someone else, could be considered obstruction. I reassured them that I wanted nothing to do with my brother, but that didn't stop them from pressing further. They asked about my parents, hinting that they believed they were still in contact with him. I told them the truth. I hadn't spoken to them since they cut me off, but it wasn't hard to guess that they were involved. Then something strange happened. My parents, who had been relentless with their manipulation and guilt-tripping, suddenly went completely silent. No calls, no messages, nothing. It wasn't a coincidence. They were hiding something. A few days later, I noticed something odd on my Instagram. A random account with no profile picture and 0 followers had started following me, and even messaged me once. I had a gut feeling. My brother was keeping tabs, which wasn't a bot. Whoever it was, they were checking every update within minutes. I had a gut feeling. My brother was keeping tabs on me. I mentioned it to my lawyer, who immediately suspected my parents were acting as a go-between. If my brother was watching me, it was likely through them. He advised me to tighten my security and keep track of anything unusual. Wanting more answers, I reached out to my aunt and uncle, family members I had always been closer to. As soon as I mentioned my parents, they cut me off with a sigh. They already knew. My parents had tried to drag them into the mess, spinning the situation to make it look like I was the one causing trouble. They had refused to take sides, but when they realized how far my parents were willing to go to protect my brother, they cut them off entirely. Then I got a call from Child Protective Services. The situation with my nieces was getting complicated, because their legal guardians were now fugitives. Placing them permanently was difficult. No one wanted to make an official decision while my brother and his wife were still on the run. The system was trying to do what was best for the girls, but without their parents in custody, it was a legal mess. Later that night, something even stranger happened. A Venmo request popped up on my phone. $5,000, from an account with a random name. I stared at it for a long time. It was obvious who it was from. I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded the request to my lawyer. A few hours later, he called me back with an update. The federal authorities were officially escalating my brother's case. They weren't just looking for him anymore, they were actively closing in. And if my parents were caught helping him, they could be facing charges too. Then I found something else. My parents had been posting online painting themselves as the victims. They were telling anyone who would listen that I had betrayed the family. They played the part of heartbroken parents, abandoned by their ungrateful son. They conveniently left out that they were harboring a fugitive and had tricked me into taking care of his kids. The more I dug, the worse it got. Through public records, I uncovered something I hadn't known before. This wasn't my brother's first fraud case. He had a criminal record dating back years. Small-scale scams, financial schemes, shady business deals. He had been doing this long before he got caught. This time, my parents had known. They had always known. That night, I reported the Venmo request to the authorities. They confirmed that they were tracking the account. Then something unexpected happened. My father, who had blocked me weeks ago, suddenly unblocked me and sent a message. He wanted to meet, no details, no explanation, just a request to talk in person. I knew exactly what this was. A last-ditch attempt to manipulate me. Instead of responding, I contacted the authorities. They advised me to go along with it, to see if my parents would slip up. If my father was reaching out now, it meant they were getting desperate. We met at a small cafe, neutral ground. My father looked exhausted, like the weight of everything was finally catching up to him. He started carefully, testing the waters, trying to see if I would be open to helping the family. He talked about loyalty, about how family should stick together no matter what. I let him talk. Then he slipped. He mentioned a vacation home, a place my brother had stayed before, a place he was using now under a fake identity. I kept my face neutral, but my mind was already racing. I had what I needed. I left the cafe without looking back. My father had no idea what he had just given me. I drove straight home and contacted the authorities. The moment I told them about the vacation home, everything changed. The agent on the other end of the line confirmed that a task force would be deployed immediately. My brother wasn't just a fugitive anymore. He was a wanted criminal attempting to flee justice under a fake identity. A week later, I got the call. My brother and his wife had been arrested. The authorities had been tracking their movements for some time, waiting for them to make a mistake. My tip about the vacation home had given them the lead they needed. The authorities had been monitoring their movements, waiting for them to make a mistake, and thanks to the information I provided, they were able to close in. The moment the news broke, my phone exploded with missed calls and messages from my parents. I ignored every single one. Then came the voicemail. My mother's voice was shrill, furious. My father's tone was quiet, cold. They called me a traitor, said I had destroyed the family, but they wanted nothing to do with me anymore. I saved the voicemail, then blocked their numbers. What I wasn't prepared for was what happened next. My mother went on a full-blown social media meltdown. Long, dramatic posts about how I had turned on my own blood. She painted herself as a devastated mother, betrayed by her son who had sold out his own brother. She twisted the story, claiming my brother was innocent, that I had overreacted, that this was all a government conspiracy. But instead of sympathy, people started calling her out. Extended family and old family friends began commenting, telling her that she was the one in the wrong. Some of them messaged me privately, offering support. Some even cut ties with my parents completely, realizing how far they had gone to enable my brother. A few days later, I got another update from Child Protective Services. My nieces had finally been placed in a stable foster home. They wouldn't be shuffled around anymore. They had found a home where they would be safe. That was the only good news in this entire mess. Then my lawyer gave me another warning. If it was proven that my parents had actively helped my brother while he was on the run, they could be facing legal consequences too. Not long after, I received a letter. It was from my brother. I didn't even open it. I threw it straight into the trash. My parents were facing their own downfall now. My mother suffered a stress-induced breakdown. My father lost his job after his employer found out about his involvement in helping my brother evade the law. The only person from my family who reached out to me with good intentions was my aunt. She called, reassuring me that I had done the right thing, that I wasn't the villain in this story, no matter how much my parents tried to paint me as one. Meanwhile, my brother's legal case was moving fast. The evidence against him was overwhelming. He wasn't going to get a light sentence. He was looking at serious federal prison time. I didn't wait around for my parents to try and reach me again. I changed my phone number. I moved to a new apartment. I made sure they could never contact me again. I lost my family, but I was finally free. The trial officially began. My brother was facing multiple charges: fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering. The prosecution had built a strong case, and from the way things were shaping up, it was clear this wasn't going to end well for him. News outlets picked up the story, reporting on how my brother had stolen from multiple businesses, moved money through fake accounts, and tried to flee the country. Pictures of him in court showed a man who looked nothing like the arrogant, smooth-talking businessman he once was. He looked defeated, unshaven, and exhausted. Meanwhile, my mother was still in complete denial. She took to Facebook again, ranting about how this was all a witch hunt and blaming corrupt law enforcement for framing my brother. She ignored every piece of evidence, every fact. According to her, This was all a setup. It didn't stop there. The extended family was now split into two sides. Those who believed the truth, and those who wanted to act like I was the villain. Some called me, telling me I did the right thing. Others sent passive-aggressive messages, blaming me for turning on my own blood. I blocked anyone who tried to guilt-trip me. The first few days of the trial were brutal. The prosecution presented bank statements, emails, and surveillance footage. It was clear my brother had been the mastermind behind the entire operation. Then, the first real betrayal happened. His former business partner, the man he had once called his right hand, turned against him. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he testified, detailing exactly how my brother had stolen money and covered it up. He provided documents, emails, and even recordings of conversations proving my brother knew what he was doing was illegal. My father lost it. He stormed out of the courtroom, muttering about how the entire case was rigged. My mother sat there, gripping her hands so tightly that her knuckles turned white. As the trial went on, my brother's defense team tried everything. They claimed he had been coerced, that he had been pressured into committing fraud. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. Then, the final blow came. His own wife, his partner in crime, took a plea deal. She testified against him. Sitting in the witness stand, she revealed everything. How my brother had planned the fraud from the beginning. How he had manipulated people to cover his tracks. How he had even tried to find ways to keep stolen money hidden in offshore accounts. She had no loyalty to him anymore. She was saving herself. My brother sat there, stiff, his expression cold as his wife testified against him. He didn't interrupt, didn't react, just clenched his jaw, staring at her like she was nothing. But when the guilty verdict was announced, I saw it. The brief moment his composure cracked. His hands trembled, his face paled, and for the first time, he looked truly afraid. My mother, who had spent so much time defending him, finally cracked. She stood up and walked out, sobbing. My father followed behind her, silent for once. The jury went into deliberation. The verdict was coming soon. The jury didn't take long to deliberate. When they returned, the courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Guilty on all counts. Fraud, conspiracy, money laundering. Every charge the prosecution brought against my brother stuck. The sentence was severe, 15 years, minimum, in federal prison. With the amount of evidence against him, there was no chance of an appeal working. He wasn't getting out anytime soon. My father clenched his fists, shaking his head. My mother let out a strangled sob, hands gripping the edge of the courtroom bench. They still didn't believe it. They still refused to accept the truth. News outlets picked up the case, exposing every detail of my brother's fraud. Articles described how he scammed businesses, forged documents, and laundered money through fake accounts. They didn't hold back. His name was everywhere. Our last name, our family name, was tied to a criminal now. Then my mother did something I should have expected. She called me. For the first time in weeks, she tried reaching out, leaving voicemail after voicemail. She wasn't screaming this time. She wasn't blaming me. She was begging. She wanted me to visit my brother in prison. She kept saying that no matter what happened, he was still family, that he needed someone to support him. I deleted every message. The day of sentencing arrived. My brother sat in the courtroom, silent, staring down at his hands as the judge handed down his fate. 20 years in federal prison, no early parole, no special treatment. The judge made it clear that my brother's actions had been deliberate, calculated, and deserving of a harsh sentence. That was the moment my father finally snapped. He stood up, yelling at the prosecutors, calling the entire case a sham. He accused them of ruining his son's life. The bailiffs moved in, warning him to leave if he didn't calm down. Meanwhile, my mother slumped in her seat, sobbing uncontrollably. The courtroom doors swung shut behind them. My brother's wife, on the other hand, got off easier. Since she cooperated with authorities, she was given a reduced sentence, only 2 years in prison. She barely looked at my brother as she was led out of the courtroom. She had thrown him under the bus to save herself. A few days later, my parents found a new way to blame me. They sent an email, long, dramatic, filled with accusations. According to them, none of this would have happened if I had just stayed quiet. If I had just trusted my family. They claimed I was the reason my brother was in prison, not his crimes. I didn't respond. I blocked their emails. Then things escalated. I came home one night to find my apartment door vandalized. Traitor was spray painted across it in bright red. I reported it to my landlord and the authorities, but there were no security cameras in that part of the complex. No proof of who did it. But I didn't need proof. I knew exactly who was behind it. That was the final straw. I sent my parents one last message. I told them that if they continued to protect a criminal, they were dead to me. I wasn't going to be part of this family anymore. Then I blocked them on everything. It was over. My aunt and uncle, one of the few sane people in the family, stepped up. They filed for permanent legal guardianship of my nieces. With my brother and his wife behind bars, they were now the girls' only real chance at stability. The courts approved it. And for the first time in this whole mess, something good came out of it. As for me, I packed up and moved. New city, new number, new life. I had lost my parents, my brother, and almost my entire extended family, but for the first time in my life, I was free. I packed up what little I had and left. A new city, a new place, a fresh start. No more looking over my shoulder. No more waiting for the next disaster. For the first time in a long time, life was quiet. Then a letter arrived. It was from my brother. Prison mail. I didn't open it. I shredded it without a second thought. Whatever he had to say, I didn't need to hear it. My parents must have finally realized I wasn't going to budge. After the authorities started watching them closely, the calls and messages abruptly stopped. It wasn't because they had given up. It was because they knew they were being monitored. Maybe they had finally accepted that I wasn't going to save them. Meanwhile, my nieces were finally finding stability. My aunt sent me updates every now and then. The girls were in therapy, adjusting to their new life. They were safe, happy, healing. Then an old friend reached out with an update I hadn't asked for. Apparently, my parents had tried to spread rumors about me. They told people I had lied about my brother, that I had exaggerated the situation, that I had turned the family against them for no reason. But no one believed them. Everyone had seen the truth unfold in the news. My parents weren't victims. They were enablers. Karma wasn't done with them yet. My father lost his job. His employer finally put the pieces together. His son was a convicted fraudster, and he had been involved in helping him hide. No company wanted to be associated with someone like that. My mother had another breakdown. She posted one last dramatic Facebook rant about how she had been betrayed by everyone, but there was no sympathy left for her. People ignored it. No one cared anymore. With legal fees draining them dry, my parents were struggling. No more handouts from my brother. No more money funneled through hidden accounts. They were just two people who had wasted everything trying to protect someone who had already lost. Then I heard about my brother. Through a relative, I found out that prison wasn't treating him well. He had gotten into fights. He had lost privileges. He wasn't adjusting to the reality of his sentence. The arrogance he had always carried with him was gone. Now he was just another inmate, counting down the years. For a brief moment I wondered if I should feel bad. I didn't. My brother made his own choices. He lied, he stole, he hurt people, and my parents stood by him through all of it. I finally visited my nieces. It had been months since I had seen them. When I walked through my aunt's door, I expected hesitation, maybe even fear, but instead I was met with smiles. They were happy. They weren't the same scared, uncertain kids who had been left on my doorstep that night. They had a home, a real one, and for the first time I knew I had made the right choice. Before I left, I took one final step. I legally changed my last name, cutting the last remaining tie to my past. Filling out the paperwork felt surreal, but as I signed my new name, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I was no longer bound by their mistakes. No more ties to my family's reputation. No more connection to a name that had been dragged through the mud. I was free. I deleted the last few remaining contacts linked to my parents and my brother. There was nothing left to say. Now, I focus on my career, my future, and the life I fought so hard to rebuild. Sometimes, family isn't worth the pain. Cutting them off saved my life.